This is not a letter intended for home, and it is certainly not a medical chart. This small notebook, tucked securely beneath the loose floorboard under my cot, is where the truth, the unsettling, quiet truth lies. It is the only place I can write down the things I see, the things that nag at me late at night when the ward is finally quiet and the wind rattles the canvas roof of the tent. I'm a nurse, trained to see wounds, to measure temperatures, and to listen to the steady rhythm of a failing heart. But lately, I've been using those same senses to watch and listen and measure something else entirely: deceit. The truth is, I suspect one of my patients is a spy. It's a ridiculous theatrical thought, something out of a pulp novel, but the feeling, the cold knot in my stomach that tightens every time I pass his cot is agonizingly real. I have to protect my patients, all of them, and if my suspicion is correct, one of them poses a threat to every soul sleeping under this makeshift roof. This diary is my record, my quiet defense. I notice the small things: a glance, a note, a whispered word. I write every detail in my diary, unsure who I could trust, yet determined to protect my patients. The hospital sits heavy in the mud now. It's early fall, but the damp cold of Europe has already sunk deep into our bones and the canvas walls of the main ward. We are an Allied field hospital close enough to the action that the muffled sound of artillery fire is just another part of the constant. Background noise like the drip of condensation off the tent poles or the low moan of a soldier struggling to breathe. We are a crucial, chaotic center point, a brief stop between the trenches and recovery. I am Florence Miller, and I came across the ocean from Nebraska to serve as a nurse. When I signed up, I expected exhaustion and trauma, which I have certainly found. But I never anticipated this specific flavor of fear, the fear that doesn't stem from a bombardment, but from a quiet internal betrayal. It all started the day Corporal Davies arrived. He was brought in 3 weeks ago. Not badly wounded, at least not by the standards of the boys we usually get. A shrapnel wound to the shoulder, a messy, painful thing, but clean, already cleaned and bandaged when he reached us after being stabilized further up the line. He was listed as British, part of the Signals Corps. He was conscious, articulate, and apologetic for taking up a bed. The first thing I noted, and the first thing I wrote down in this book, was his eyes. They weren't the eyes of a wounded man, not usually. The other soldiers, they arrive hollowed out, consumed by pain or shock, or the crushing realization of how close they came to death. Their eyes are wide, often unfocused, or sometimes simply closed in exhaustion. Corporal Davies's eyes, however, were keen. They were assessing. He didn't look at the ceiling or the door or the pain in his own arm. He looked at the layout of the cots, the placement of the kerosene lamps, and specifically, the thin wire running overhead that connected the main communications office to Dr. Thorne's desk. It was a professional scrutiny, not a patient's casual glance. That was the first whisper of conflict in my mind. I remember that day clearly. The air smelled of wet wool and disinfectants, and Nurse Eliza was complaining loudly about the quality of the powdered milk. It was a normal day, a grim, necessary rhythm of life. Davies ruined the rhythm. Nurse Miller, he had said, his voice surprisingly robust for someone who had just endured a rough ride down the line. His accent was precise, almost too polished for a corporal, even one in the specialized signals corps. It's remarkable, the speed at which you all managed to stabilize and move us through. You're working against the clock, aren't you? Getting the field operational must be a nightmare. I gave him a standard, professional answer about dedication and duty. But his phrasing stuck with me. Getting the field operational. That's the language of a general staff briefing, not the casual observation of a corporal who just wants painkillers. The days here bleed into one another, marked only by the shifting light through the canvas and the stack of finished dressings. My life revolves around charting, cleaning, changing, and encouraging. But now it also revolves around watching Corporal Davies. He is the perfect patient in many ways. He rarely complains. He insists on trying to feed himself, even with his dominant arm immobilized. He's polite to the orderlies. He attempts cheerful, if brief, conversation with the men around him, offering a kind word or a light joke. He builds trust easily. But trust is a fragile commodity here, and I've watched it shatter too many times not to be vigilant. Monday morning. The morning mist was so thick today I could barely see the cook tent. We were serving weak coffee and oatmeal that had already cooled. Davies was sitting up, leaning against the damp pillows. He was reading a copy of The Stars and Stripes, the Allied Forces newspaper. A young private named Thompson, who had been terribly rattled by shell shock and couldn't stop staring at the ceiling, was mumbling quietly 3 cots down. It was a distressed, unfocused sound. Most of the men, including Davies, ignored it. They learned to filter out the background suffering. It's a necessary defense. But Davies didn't filter it out entirely. He set his paper down, not on his chest like most would, but carefully beside him. He pulled a piece of loose thread from the rough blanket and rolled it precisely between his thumb and forefinger. He waited until Dr. Thorne walked past, heading toward the supply area. As soon as Thorne was gone, Davies leaned slightly toward the adjacent cot where Sergeant O'Malley was trying to write a letter home. Davies asked quietly, "Sergeant, have you noticed how often the doctor seems to be leaving the ward these days?" "Seems busy," O'Malley grunted, concentrating on his penmanship. "Aye, he's always busy. Probably arguing with the quartermaster over penicillin again." Davies smiled, a charming, quick smile. "Yes, likely. I was just observing the general flow of traffic. Do they often keep the communications tent open all night, even when the lines are quiet?" O'Malley finally looked up, irritated by the interruption. "How would I know, mate? I haven't been outside of this damn canvas in a week. Ask one of the orderlies if you're bored." Davies immediately retreated, perfectly, gracefully. "Of course, my apologies, Sergeant. Just trying to distract myself from this throbbing arm." The conversation lasted less than 90 seconds, but it was 3 questions too many about routine activities that a patient should not care about. Why did he ask O'Malley, who was clearly absorbed, rather than waiting for an orderly who had actually been outside? And why did he frame it as an observation about the doctor's movements, immediately pivoting to the communications tent? I cleaned his thermometer and walked away, my hand trembling slightly. It was so small, so subtle, I could almost convince myself it was paranoia. But I wrote it all down, asking about communication hours, not typical patient inquiry. Our days are marked by rituals of comfort and hygiene. The scrubbing of hands, the boiling of instruments, the distributing of rations. Davies adheres to all of them, sometimes too perfectly. We were short on dressings the other day. Supplies are always tenuous, and the trucks had been delayed by a muddy road. Dr. Thorne was stressed, muttering about having to prioritize bandages for the serious abdominal wounds. Davies heard this. Instead of asking for his dressing change, which was due, he waited until the evening rounds, when the doctor was exhausted, before mentioning his shoulder. He timed it perfectly when Thorne was too tired to process the conversation deeply. "Doctor," Davies said, holding his arm still, "I hope my dressing isn't a burden tonight. I know supplies are tight. I heard you mentioning the transport problems. Is that still the main road bottleneck? Or are the railways causing trouble too?" Thorne sighed, massaging his temples. "It's the mud, Corporal. Everything slows down in the mud." "Naturally," Davies replied, nodding sagely. "The heavy rains are playing havoc with the whole operation, aren't they? It's a pity. You need those routes clear for the big equipment, not just the medical transport." Thorne just waved his hand dismissively. "Just get some sleep, Corporal. Nurse Miller will change that dressing first thing tomorrow." What did he mean by big equipment? Why did a wounded signals corporal care about the logistics of heavy transport and railway bottlenecks? It sounded like someone trying to confirm operational weak points. When I changed his dressing the next morning, I noticed something else, a pattern in his reading material. He only reads the military sections of the newspaper, the reports on strategic movements and logistics. The human interest stories, the accounts of valor, the comic strips, he leaves those parts untouched, neatly folded back. His interest is purely operational, purely analytical. We use cheap, standard issue pens here, the kind that smear easily. They are meant for writing charts and tagging personal effects. Davies had his own pen, a rather handsome silver fountain pen. It seemed out of place for a combat soldier, especially one who should be carrying only the bare minimum of kit. One afternoon, I found him lying very still, pretending to sleep. His good hand, the one not wounded, was resting lightly on the small wooden bedside table where we stacked supplies. Beneath his hand, almost completely covered, was a small square of paper. It looked like the reverse side of a cigarette packet, smooth and yellowish. When I approached, ostensibly to adjust his blanket, his eyes snapped open instantly, not slowly, like a man waking from natural sleep, but sharply, like a man caught off guard. He immediately covered the paper completely with his hand. "Oh, nurse," he murmured, his voice slightly husky. "I must have drifted off. Sorry. Just checking on you, Corporal," I said calmly, meeting his gaze. I lingered just a second too long. In that moment, I saw the faintest trace of blue ink bleeding through the side of his palm onto the wood. He had been writing something small and quick. "Is there anything I can get you?" I asked. "No, thank you." "Just tired." I moved on, but the image of that square paper and the blue ink stayed with me. If he was writing a letter, he would use the official Red Cross stationery we provided, which was stacked right next to him. If he was writing a medical note, he would use his chart. He was writing something secret, something that had to fit into a tiny, easily concealable space. I decided I needed a closer look at his effects. It goes against every code of ethics and trust I operate under, but the potential danger outweighed my professional reluctance. Protecting the whole ward comes first. My opportunity came during the busiest time of the day late afternoon, when the most serious cases needed dressing changes and feedings. Davies was scheduled for x-rays down the hall. I timed it perfectly, waiting until Dr. Thorne and Nurse Eliza were preoccupied with Private Jenkins, who had developed a bad cough. I approached Davies's cot. His personal effects were in a small, rough wooden box beneath the bed. He had been insistent that no one touch it, claiming the contents were fragile mementos. I slipped down onto my knees, pretending to retrieve a drop syringe. The box was not locked. I lifted the lid slowly, careful not to let the dry wood creak. Inside, there was a worn Bible, a spare uniform shirt folded impeccably, a small tin of English biscuits, surprisingly fresh for a field operation, and a handful of photos, a woman, likely his wife, and a cheerful boy of about 10. All standard, all heartbreakingly normal. But then I lifted the Bible. It was heavy, heavier than it should have been, and the pages were brittle, almost unused. I opened it to the book of Psalms. The center of the book, pages 87 through 92, had been meticulously cut out, leaving a hollowed cavity inside the volume. My breath caught in my throat. This was not a soldier carrying a comfort item. This was a concealment mechanism. The cavity was empty, but it smelled faintly of paper, old glue, and something metallic, perhaps pencil graphite. I had to put it back immediately. I returned the Bible, closed the box, and slid out from under the cot, my heart pounding a rhythm that felt loud enough to wake the whole ward. I returned to my desk, my mind reeling. The fear was no longer subtle. It was a tangible coldness in my chest. He was hiding things. I jotted the details down in my diary later that night, using the flickering kerosene lamplight, hollowed Bible. Psalms 87 to 92 removed, used for concealment. Fragile mementos lie. Tuesday evening. The psychological strain of playing the dedicated nurse while also being a secret investigator is exhausting. I feel constantly stretched thin, balancing patient care with discreet observation. This morning, Davies was attempting to walk a short distance to the latrine tent. I was assisting him, helping steady his pace. He was leaning heavily on me, and for the first time, I noticed the solace of his boots. They were nearly new, barely scuffed. This is highly unusual for anyone who has seen active combat or spent weeks maneuvering in the mud and rubble near the front. Most soldiers' boots are cracked, soaked through, and repaired multiple times. Davies's boots suggested short, precise movements made away from the lines, or perhaps careful, measured movements towards a target. He seemed to notice my gaze lingered on his footwear. He stopped walking and suddenly winced dramatically, holding his shoulder. "Blast it, nurse. The movement always seems to catch me right here." I offered sympathy and directed him to sit back down. But I felt the performance, the abrupt shift in demeanor from steady walker to agonized patient. It was designed to pull my attention away from the boots. I must be careful. I cannot let him know that I am watching him so closely. My vigilance must remain invisible. The small tin of biscuits, the English ones, sat on his table for days. Davies never seemed to open it. This afternoon he finally did. He offered one to the orderly who was mopping the floor. "Here, lad, treat yourself. They're excellent shortbread." The orderly, Private Harrison, thanked him profusely. He ate the biscuit immediately. Davies watched him with an intense, almost fixed interest. Not the friendly gaze of a man sharing food, but the sharp focus of a scientist observing an experiment. After Harrison left, Davies closed the tin and immediately picked up his paper again, resuming his reading of the logistics reports. Later, I was making sure the water pitcher was full when I saw him holding the tin again. He wasn't opening it. He was running his fingers over the edges, specifically the thin seams where the lid met the body of the tin. He did this for several minutes. It looked like he was checking for movement, for tampering, or perhaps ensuring a seal. It made me wonder, was the biscuit tin a secondary storage unit? Or was he using the mundane act of sharing a biscuit to test whether the contents were safe or perhaps observed? The detail is maddening because it could mean nothing, or it could mean everything. Wednesday morning, Dr. Thorne is a good man. Exhausted, dedicated, but sometimes too trusting of the regulations. He trusts the uniform. I cannot bring this to him without evidence. A hollowed-out Bible and unusual interest in railway logistics are not proof of espionage. They are merely highly suspicious circumstances. I need to know what was in that book, and why he keeps checking his biscuit tin. The men in the ward are getting comfortable with him. He seems to have an inexhaustible supply of fascinating stories about London and the various ports he deworked through before the war. They see him as educated, a man who knows the world. He gathers information under the guise of casual conversation. Just this morning, he was talking to a young Canadian engineer, Lieutenant Shaw, who was waiting to be evacuated due to severe trench foot. "It's amazing, the work you engineers do," Davies praised him sincerely. "The amount of material handling required just for a temporary bridge must be astronomical. You must be learning techniques that will revolutionize post-war construction." Shaw beamed, pleased by the genuine flattery. "Well, we do what we can. We've been using a lot of those new prefabricated metal trusses, the ones that can handle 50-ton loads. They're heavy, but they speed up deployment immensely." Davies took a slow sip of his water. 50-ton load capacity. Fascinating. Is that the new standard for the main crossing points, or only the secondary roads? Shaw, proud of his expertise, launched into a detailed, technical explanation of the standard load capacities being utilized by the divisional engineers, citing specific regions where the heavier equipment was being deployed. I was charting vital signs nearby. My pen hovered over the chart. Davies wasn't asking about how difficult the work was or if Shaw was comfortable. He was asking for load-bearing tolerances and deployment locations, He was mapping vulnerabilities. I wrote in the margins of my own diary, not the chart, confirmed detailed knowledge extraction. Subject is gathering specific engineering metrics under guise of flattering conversation. The constant rain has turned the area surrounding the hospital into a deep, sucking bog. The isolation is intense. We are surrounded by mud, the sounds of suffering, and the quiet paranoia that has begun to consume my waking hours. Sleep has become elusive. I find myself checking the floorboards under my cot multiple times a night, just to ensure this small, sacred record is safe. I had a conversation with Nurse Eliza today. She's been here longer than I have and has seen more terrible things. She's generally cynical, but fiercely loyal to the patients. I needed to gauge her instincts without revealing my own fears. Eliza, I said, while we were sterilizing equipment over the small stove, the heat failing to penetrate the cold tent atmosphere. Have you noticed anything unusual about Corporal Davies? He's such a perfect patient. Eliza squinted, pouring boiling water over the metal trays. Too perfect, Flo. Sometimes the quiet ones are the hardest work because you never know what they're thinking. He's got that look like he's always calculating the next move, not resting. This confirmation, mild as it was, settled my stomach momentarily. I wasn't completely alone in feeling this anomaly. I suppose I mused, keeping my tone casual. He asks very specific questions sometimes, about logistics. I wonder why a signals corporal would be so interested in engineer capacity. Eliza shrugged, drying a scalpel carefully. Oh, they all are, Flo. They all want to know when they're moving on, how fast, and if the supplies will follow. It's the nature of being sidelined. They think if they know the overall picture, they feel safer. Her explanation was logical, comforting, and utterly dismissive of my anxiety. She saw the pattern as typical wartime paranoia. I saw the pattern as deliberate intelligence gathering. I knew then that I couldn't bring this up to anyone else, not yet. My suspicions required confirmation that went beyond intuition. Thursday afternoon, Davies was healing quickly. Too quickly, perhaps. The physical wound in his shoulder is clean, the inflammation is minimal, and the pain seems to be rapidly diminishing. He's starting to move his arm with an unnatural ease. We've seen men with far less serious wounds linger for weeks, battling localized infection or simply lacking the internal will to recover. Davies possesses an enormous, directed will. He is driven to leave this place. I watched him shave today. He was using a standard razor, awkwardly managing it one-handed. He missed a spot near his jawline. As he adjusted his mirror, I noticed something settle on the skin behind his earlobe, partially obscured by his short hair. It was a faint scar, circular and slightly raised. It was professionally done, old, and perfectly healed. It looked exactly like a small surgical insertion point, possibly for a listening device or a tracking beacon that had since been removed. It was tiny, almost invisible, unless you were standing right next to him watching him shave. I told him I needed to check his pulse in his temple. It was a flimsy excuse, but I needed to get close. As my fingers pressed against his skin, I tilted my head slightly, confirming the faint ring of tissue. It felt different, denser, almost like cartilage, where there should have been soft skin. Your pulse is strong, Corporal, I murmured, stepping away. He gave me his polished smile. Good genes, nurse, must be all the British tea. But the smile didn't reach his eyes. His gaze was fixed on the small surgical scar, which he seemed to think I hadn't noticed. He was instantly guarded. Entry update, faint circular scar insertion point behind right ear. Possibly removed tracking or communication tech. The tent canvas is old, stained, and patched in several places. The light filters through differently depending on the patch material. Most of the men gaze up at the ceiling when they are bored, lost in thought, or too pained to look elsewhere. Davies has been gazing up a lot, but he doesn't stare blankly. He traces paths. I sat near him for an hour, charting, observing him peripherally. He was using his index finger slightly elevated to trace lines on the air above him. He followed the seams and discoloration lines of the canvas. It looked like he was charting points. I tried to replicate the pattern he was tracing later when he was asleep. I realized that the large, distinct water stain near the main tent support, combined with the smaller, dark mildew spot near the corner, could easily serve as anchors on a crude map grid. He wasn't tracing random lines. He was visualizing movement between fixed points. This requires a mental image of a map, a specific geographic layout that he is attempting to overlay onto the chaotic geometry of the ceiling. He is rehearsing routes. I feel like a lighthouse keeper sitting here logging the storms. Every day brings another small wave of evidence that I must record, analyze, and keep secret. Friday midday, today, the hospital received a delivery of letters from the quartermaster. It's always a huge lift to morale. There was a stack for Davies. About half a dozen envelopes, all addressed in the same neat, looping handwriting of the woman in the photograph, his wife, presumably. He took the stack and immediately turned his back to the ward. This is normal. Privacy is rare and treasured. But his movements were odd. Instead of tearing into the first envelope, he carefully lifted the flap of the first three and examined the inside of the envelope before extracting the contents. He was checking the paper, running his thumb over the glued seams. He wasn't looking for a loving message. He was checking for secondary messages, codes, or foreign materials concealed within the postal paper. He was checking for tampering. Then he did something even stranger with the last letter. He opened it, read the contents, and then, instead of putting it with the others, he tore the letter and the envelope into small, perfectly equal strips. He didn't crumble the paper. He made neat, precise tiers. He placed the strips into his empty coffee mug. When an orderly came by to clear the mug, Davy stopped him. "Thank you, Private. I'll take care of this one myself. I want to make sure I get the last sip of that weak coffee before you clean it." He was protecting the strips of paper. He didn't want the evidence of the destroyed letter to be casually thrown into the refuse pile, where it might be seen or, God forbid, reassembled. He waited until the next round of kerosene refilling, when everyone was distracted by the smell of oil and the movement of the orderlies. He took the mug, walked toward the incinerator barrel outside, and I watched through the gap in the tent flap as he tipped the paper strips into the already hot coals. He didn't just burn them. He stood there until the paper was completely reduced to ash, stirring the remnants with a long piece of wire. I know, unequivocally, that one of those letters contained something he needed to destroy instantly and completely. I wrote down, my hand shaking slightly, tore up and incinerated one letter completely, checked all other incoming mail for tampering secondary contents, extremely security conscious. The nights are the worst. The hospital settles into a low hum of pain and exhaustion. The only light comes from the dim blue-shaded bulbs near the charts. I sit at my desk, sometimes knitting, sometimes reading, but mostly I listen to the cadence of the ward. Davy sleeps lightly, lighter than anyone else here. Most men are so traumatized or exhausted they sleep like the dead, deeply and defensively. Davies wakes at the slightest sound, a sneeze, a dropped pan, the shift of my chair. 2 nights ago, I witnessed the most concerning incident yet. It was around 0300. The air was cold, and the sound of the nearby river was loud. Davies was awake. He was sitting up, leaning against his pillows, seemingly staring into space. I saw him reach into his bedside box, the one containing the hollowed-out Bible. He didn't pull out the Bible this time. He pulled out the uniform shirt. It was neatly folded, and he held it in his lap. He didn't unfold it. He just ran his fingers along the cuffs and the collar. Then I watched as he carefully removed a button from the front of the shirt, the third button down. He didn't use a knife or scissors. He used his nails, carefully prying the threads loose until the button came free. It wasn't a quick, desperate removal. It was meticulous, practiced. Once the button was off, he didn't discard it. He rolled it between his fingers, then placed it gently onto the small wooden ledge of his table. He then reached into his pocket and pulled out another identical button. He then took a needle and thread, which he must have smuggled or acquired quietly, and began re-sewing the replacement button onto the shirt. It took him nearly 15 minutes, working only by the faint blue light, his wounded arm held uselessly to his side. His focus was absolute. He finished, checked the strength of the stitches, and put the needle and thread away. He then took the original button, the one he had meticulously removed, and swallowed it. He took a slow drink of water from his cup and swallowed the button whole. It was a clear, deliberate action. Why swap a button? Why swallow the original? The button he swallowed must have been a micro-container, a storage device, or perhaps a tracking signal. And the reason he replaced it so quickly was to ensure that the shirt, his spare uniform, remained outwardly unremarkable. The original button was either evidence, or it contained a crucial piece of information, a message that needed to be ingested, or something that needed to be destroyed through digestion. I stayed frozen at my desk until the sun began to rise, the cold fear radiating through my body. He is not just reading newspapers. He is performing operational tradecraft right here in my hospital ward. Saturday midday, I feel like I am living two parallel lives. In one, I am Florence Miller, the competent, calm nurse who reassures the wounded that they will see their families again. In the other, I am Florence Miller, the anxious watcher, the keeper of secrets, waiting for the moment when the mask finally slips. Davies, having recovered remarkably from his shoulder injury and having successfully swallowed a key piece of evidence, is now spending hours attempting to write letters home. He is writing on the standard Red Cross stationery, penning long, sentimental messages to his wife about missing her, describing the rain, and complaining mildly about the quality of the powdered eggs. It's completely generic, beautifully safe, and utterly unconvincing. He always keeps his dictionary close by, a small dog-eared paperback that looks like it has been dragged through several campaigns. I often see him consult it, ostensibly checking the spelling of a common word, or looking up a synonym for dreadful or exhausted, but today, I saw him consult it 3 times while writing a single sentence about the muddy roads. When he finally stepped away to use the latrine, I seized my chance. It was risky. The latrine tent is only a short distance, and he could return quickly. I walked to his cot, pretending to straighten the linen. I picked up the dictionary. It fell open naturally to the section starting with the letter W. The word Wessex was circled faintly in pencil. Wessex is an ancient geographical region of southern England, not a current military operational code word, and certainly not a word he would need to write about the muddy roads of France. I flipped through quickly. Danzig was circled in D, Rhine was circled in R, Freiburg was circled in F. These were not common English words he would need to check. They were locations all in Germany or historically sensitive German regions. My heart hammered again. He is building a coded message using geographical locations, possibly indexing specific points within his letters, or using these names as triggers for further conversation. He is communicating, and he is using his recovery time in an allied hospital to do it. I replaced the dictionary and stood up, smoothing the blanket again. I almost ran back to my desk. This is proof, I told myself. A hollowed Bible, swallowed containers, load-bearing questions, and a coded dictionary pointing to specific German towns. This is espionage. Now I have the evidence, or at least enough highly suspicious data points to warrant an investigation. The internal conflict is crippling. I swore an oath of service, which includes protecting the integrity of the Allied effort. That means reporting this, but whom do I report it to? Dr. Thorne is a field surgeon, not security clearance. If I tell him, He risks exposing the entire investigation by treating Davies differently or questioning him clumsily. There's a small military police detachment about 5 miles back, but reporting through official channels would require explaining my unauthorized search of his personal effects, the Bible, and the dictionary. I could be censured or worse, ignored as a hysterical nurse overreacting to her exhaustion. The spy, if alerted, would simply claim he's a devout man who uses his dictionary to study geography, and that he tore up a sentimental letter because it was too painful to keep. I have to handle this myself, at least until I can gather information that is irrefutable and can be obtained without compromising my position. I need to know who he is waiting for or who he is trying to contact. I realize that my best weapon is not confrontation, but observation. I am closer to him than any intelligence officer could be. I have access to his routine, his environment, and his moments of weakness. Sunday evening, I have formulated a strategy. It is risky, but necessary. I will introduce an operational variable. Davies has been asking about the field communications equipment. He knows where the line runs from the main tent to the small field office. He knows the general schedule of the orderlies who carry messages between the main command and our medical necks. Tomorrow, I will make an intentional mistake. I will speak too loudly about a planned movement of the most valuable patient we have captured. German major who is recovering from a severe leg injury. The major is being held in a separate annex, extremely high value and crucial for intelligence. Davies believes he is anonymous. He believes he is safe to gather information. I will test his reaction to high value immediate intelligence, seeing if he breaks protocol and attempts at communication. Monday morning. The morning was typical damp, cold, and busy. I made sure to be standing near Nurse Eliza and Private Harrison, the orderly, while Davies was awake and attempting to eat his breakfast. I waited for a natural pause in the conversation after Eliza complained about the smell of the new bandages. Speaking of transport, I said loudly, aiming my voice to carry slightly beyond the usual volume. I heard Dr. Thorne confirm it this morning. They are moving the priority patient, the major, tonight. Late shift. They're taking him further back to the main hospital complex. It must be complicated. They need a full escort and 3 field vehicles, starting right after the midnight radio silence. Eliza looked confused. The German major? I thought he wasn't stable enough for transport yet. Apparently, the orders came down from command. Immediate relocation. They want him out of this forward position before the weather completely collapses those secondary roads. I asserted, trying to maintain a tone of professional concern. I kept my eyes on my charts, but my entire focus was on Corporal Davies. He didn't flinch. He didn't drop his spoon. He finished chewing his cold oatmeal slowly. His physical response was perfect control. But then he paused, placing his spoon carefully back on the tray. He cleared his throat. "That sounds stressful, Nurse Miller," he said, his voice calm, polite, and interested, but not alarmed. A high-profile evacuation is always difficult, but it's good that command is thinking ahead about the road conditions. I heard the supply trucks are having terrible trouble navigating the crossroads near the old railway spur. If the major is using that route, they'll need every bit of speed they can muster. Again, the highly specific knowledge, the old railway spur. That information was not publicly available in any newspaper, and it was a strategic point relevant only to transport, not medical triage. He was attempting to verify the route I had implied. I smiled calmly. "I wouldn't know the specific route, Corporal. I just know he's going late tonight." Davies nodded, satisfied. He returned to his meal. The hook was set. Now I had to wait to see if he acted on the intelligence. If he was a spy, he had less than 12 hours to communicate the time and approximate location of the transport of a high-value prisoner. The day dragged. I spent the afternoon checking patients, making small talk, and counting the minutes. Davies maintained his facade of cheerful, recovering boredom. He read his paper, talked gently with the men, and occasionally asked an orderly for a warm drink. Around 1800, during the shift change, a critical piece of the puzzle fell into place. Private Harrison, the orderly who had received the biscuit, approached me, looking troubled. "Nurse Miller," he whispered, "I need to tell you something weird about Corporal Davies." My heart seized up. "What is it, Harrison?" "His boots." I was cleaning under his cot, and I saw his boots. "I swear they're brand new." That's odd enough, but I also saw him polishing them. Not just shining them up, but polishing the solace, making sure there wasn't a speck of mud or dust on the treads. This confirmed my earlier suspicion about the boots. But Harrison added a crucial detail, and he did something else, ma'am. He took the laces out, and then he pulled the tongue forward. And right under the tongue, he peeled up a tiny piece of the leather lining. It looked like he was hiding something underneath it. Harrison was too nervous to ask Davies what he was doing, so he pretended he hadn't seen it. He told me he thought it was some kind of good luck charm he was hiding. "Thank you, Private Harrison," I said, keeping my voice level. "That's very observant of you. Just keep doing your work." Entry update: hidden compartment revealed in the boot lining. Likely storing the written note previously observed on the cigarette paper. The hours between supper and midnight were agonizing. The ward lights were dimmed at 2200. The rain returned, heavier now, drumming an unrelenting rhythm on the canvas. I sat at my desk, knitting a coarse sock, my hands moving automatically while my eyes stayed fixed on Davies's cot. He was seemingly asleep, his breathing even and shallow. At 0015, the word was perfectly silent save for the rain. This was the time I had stated the transport would be moving. Davies moved, slowly, like a snake shedding its skin. He didn't make a sound. His wounded arm, which had seemed so stiff and painful just hours ago, moved smoothly as he reached under his cot and retrieved the small, polished boot. He didn't put it on. He simply sat there, holding it in his lap. Then, with infinite care, he worked his fingers under the tongue, finding the tiny flap Harrison had described. He pulled out a single small square of yellowish paper, the cigarette packet paper. He brought it close to his chest, shielding it completely from my view, or the light, and seemed to read or review the contents. Then the final, chilling piece of operational tradecraft. He didn't put the paper in his pocket or hide it back in the boot. He pressed it into the palm of his hand, and then he pressed the hand against the side of his own neck, near the carotid artery. He held it there, perfectly still, for perhaps 2 full minutes. My training flashed through my mind. He was using his own body heat to secure the contents of the paper. This is a common practice for spies, using water-soluble ink or chemical writing that needs to be briefly activated or bonded to the paper before transmission. He then folded the paper again, even smaller this time, and placed it inside the biscuit tin. Not the biscuit tin itself, but a seam near the bottom which seemed to have been reinforced or modified. After that, he reached up to the wire that ran along the tent pole, the communications line I had noted him observing on his first day. He didn't touch the wire. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the fountain pen, the silver one that seemed too refined for the front lines. He held the pen steady, almost like a divining rod, about 2 inches below the communications wire. He held it there for exactly 60 seconds, his eyes closed. His face was a mask of intense concentration. He was not writing, he was transmitting. The fountain pen was not a writing instrument. It was a receiver, or possibly a directional short burst transmitter, designed to send a quick burst of highly compressed data, the contents of the heated paper, to a listening post, likely disguised as a truck or weather station outside the immediate hospital grounds. The communication line above was acting as a directional antenna, guiding the burst toward the necessary receiver. The message was being sent. The high-value prisoner, the major, was moving tonight past the railway spur. He lowered the pen, placed it back in his pocket, and slid down under his blankets. Within seconds, his breathing was back to its light, shallow rhythm. The whole action took less than 5 minutes. I sat there, frozen, the knitting needles silent in my lap. I had confirmation. It was real. Corporal Davies, the perfect patient, was the spy in the Allied ward. Tuesday morning, the intelligence was sent. Now the danger is imminent. If command relies on the security of the Major's transport, Davies' information could lead to an ambush. I needed to act fast, but I couldn't simply state that a patient swallowed a button and used a pen to transmit information through a tent pole. I made a decision that morning. I went directly to Dr. Thorne's small office, ignoring the rising sun and the morning rounds. Thorne was pouring himself a bitter cup of coffee, looking haggard. "Nurse Miller," he said, surprised by my intensity. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't, doctor. I need to speak to you." Not about a patient's health, but about operational security. I kept the focus narrow and factual, avoiding the emotional details of the button and the dictionary. I focused on the communications vulnerability. "Doctor, I believe the communication setup in the main ward is compromised. I have observed Corporal Davies, the one with the shoulder wound, demonstrating an unnatural interest in our operational communications wire and specific knowledge of restricted troop and transport movements." I explained his questions about load-bearing capacity and the railway spur. I mentioned his focused scrutiny of the wire, framing it as an obsessive compulsion rather than deliberate transmission. Thorne was immediately skeptical, tapping his pen on his desk. "Miller, he's a signals corporal. They're trained to observe communications. The man is recovering from a wound. His mind is probably bored. Doctor, his knowledge is too precise. Furthermore, I have serious concerns that he has managed to glean the transport details regarding the Major S evacuation scheduled for tonight. I believe he has already communicated that information." I leaned forward, trying to convey the gravity without revealing my unauthorized methods. "You must, at the very least, call command immediately and change the Major's transport route, time, and escort details. Tell them you have discovered a structural weakness in the field hospital, S-wire system that may have inadvertently broadcast sensitive data." Thorne studied my face. He saw the genuine, unvarnished fear and conviction. He didn't see hysteria. He saw a nurse putting her professional career on the line. He picked up the phone receiver, the line crackling ominously. "I will make the call, nurse, but if this is based on conjecture, there will be serious questions." "I understand, doctor," I replied, my voice steady. "Just ensure the Major's route is altered drastically. Use the old dirt track behind the supply depot, the one nobody uses." Thorne nodded, already dialing the numbers for Command HQ. By midday, the change in atmosphere was palpable. The military police detail that usually patrols the perimeter had been reinforced, and 2 jeeps were parked discreetly near the hospital entrance, ostensibly waiting for wounded, but clearly there for security. Davies noticed it instantly. He was sitting up, reading, but his gaze constantly tracked the orderlies and the new faces. He was waiting for the fallout of his transmission. He was waiting for a sudden, chaotic incident outside the hospital gates. The Major's transport was successfully rerouted and completed in the late afternoon, hours before the midnight time Davies had transmitted. The intended ambush, if there was one, would hit empty road. The next step was isolating Davies without causing panic. Wednesday, Dr. Thorne returned to the ward, looking profoundly uneasy. He signaled me over. "Command confirmed the route change was necessary, Miller. They thanked me for the warning about the structural weakness, but they also asked me about Corporal Davies. What did you tell them?" "I told them he was a model patient. I told them he was a signals corporal who had been asking technical questions. They want him isolated. Officially, he needs specialized treatment at the main facility. They are sending a specialized medical officer to accompany him. I knew what that meant. The specialized medical officer would be an intelligence agent. Davies was being extracted for quiet interrogation. My relief was overwhelming, but quickly replaced by renewed anxiety. I had exposed my hand to Thorn, and now Command was aware. Davies, sensing the shift in security, would know he was under suspicion. I went to Davies's bedside. "Corporal," I said gently, ensuring my voice carried the appropriate tone of sympathy. "Your recovery has been so excellent, Command has decided you require specialized physical therapy at the larger hospital facility. You will be leaving this evening." Davies looked up, his face devoid of surprise, but marked by a sudden, cold anger that flickered behind his eyes for only a millisecond. It was the only time his professional composure had completely failed him. He knew he had been caught. He knew the transport was a cover. "That's very good news, nurse," he said, recovering instantly, his smile back in place. "I'm eager to contribute again. The medical officer will be here at 2000. Please ensure your belongings are packed." As I turned to leave, he spoke again, his voice lower this time, almost a conversational murmur intended only for me. "Nurse Miller," he said, "you are incredibly observant. For a nurse, I mean. Most people only see what they expect to see." It was a warning, a confirmation. He knew I was the one who had reported him. I didn't answer. I simply continued charting, allowing the professionalism to serve as my final shield. At 1930, while the ward was having its final feeding round, the generator stuttered and died. The field hospital was plunged into pitch darkness. A general wave of low-level panic swept the cots. The orderlies scrambled for the backup lanterns. In that brief, confusing moment of darkness, Davies acted. I heard the sound of a cot leg scraping the floor, too loud and too fast. He was running toward the back flap of the tent. He was not injured, not slowed by the shoulder wound. I reacted purely instinctively. I dropped the stack of towels I was holding, yelled for the orderlies to secure the main entrance, and ran toward the sound. The field hospital is surrounded by thick mud and deep ditches. He knew he couldn't outrun the security details outside, but he was aiming for the thick cover of the nearby woods. I caught him just as he was fumbling with the heavy canvas rope of the back exit flap. I threw myself against his good arm, grabbing his wrist. "Corporal, stop." He didn't speak. He simply wrenched his arm free, his strength astonishing. He elbowed me hard in the face, not with malice, but with pure, trained efficiency. I fell back against a stack of crates, the kerosene lamp on my desk rattling. The sudden, intense pain blinded me momentarily. He pushed the flap open and was gone. But in the moment he turned, I saw what he held in his hand. Not a weapon, but the small, silver fountain pen. He was attempting to transmit a final burst message, perhaps an SOS, or a message confirming his exposure. I staggered to my feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in my cheek. I ran to the flap and stepped out into the pouring rain and the sudden glare of the orderlies' lanterns. He was already 20 yards away, sprinting across the muddy, uneven ground toward the dense line of trees. He's running. The spy is running. I screamed, pointing into the darkness. The military police patrol, alerted by the commotion, immediately opened fire with warning shots into the air, while a group of 3 officers began the chase. I stood there, soaking wet, watching the lanterns bobbing in the distance as they pursued the man who had been resting, pretending to be wounded in my ward for 3 weeks. I looked down. Where Davies had stood, near the flap, something small and white lay half submerged in the mud. I reached down and picked it up. It was the square of yellowish paper. The heat-activated message. The writing was faint, done in a chemical ink that was already dissolving in the heavy rain. But I could make out the top line, written in perfect, coded German. Verskert, der Funker wird beobachtet. Translated, delayed. The radio operator is under observation. He wasn't sending the ambush details. He was sending confirmation that the transport had been successfully changed and that his position was compromised. The warning I had given Thorne had directly interfered with their operation. I held the disintegrating paper in my hand. I had saved the Major, but I had exposed myself. The spy was loose, and he knew who I was. The pursuit calls faded into the night. I stood alone in the rain, the only light coming from the field hospital tent, the mud thick and cold around my feet. I am safe for now, but the knowledge I hold, and the fact that Davies knows I hold it, means the tension is only beginning. He is outside, and I'm inside. I wonder who else he was working with. This war is not fought only with guns. It is fought with quiet patience, code words, and the careful manipulation of trust. I am still here, waiting. The hardest part of espionage is not the action, but the waiting for the counteraction. I have to be ready to protect this place. I look at the now empty space. I know this is only the beginning of the story. The first act has closed, not with a bang, but with the soft, chilling realization that the calm is a lie. The rain was cold, instantly soaking the coarse wool of my uniform, but I didn't notice the chill. All I felt was the thrumming pain in my cheek where Corporal Davies. His elbow had connected and the sickening rush of adrenaline. I stood outside the tent flap, the yellowed paper dissolving rapidly in my grasp, watching the bobbing lanterns of the search party disappear into the black veil of the woods. The smell of wet earth and fear hung heavy in the air. The spy was gone. He had fled my ward, confirming everything I suspected. The paper crumpled in my hand, leaving a faint, greasy residue of ink and desperation. Verskert. Der Funker word beobachtet. Delayed. The radio operator is under observation. My warning to Dr. Thorne, my improvised lie about a structural weakness in the wire had worked. Davies hadn't been able to prevent the rerouting of the Major's transport, but he had managed to send a final, critical warning to his network. The Allied lines were alerted, and the radio silence period was compromised. I walked slowly back into the main tent, my uniform dripping mud onto the clean floorboards. The generator sputtered back to life, flooding the ward with the harsh, familiar glow of the kerosene lamps. The low murmuring of the recovering soldiers settled down as the orderlies reassured them it was just a mechanical failure. Private Harrison, his face pale in the artificial light, rushed up to me. "Nurse Miller, are you hurt?" He ran right past me. "I'm fine, Harrison," I managed, touching my aching cheek. "He's gone. Report immediately to Dr. Thorne. Tell him the situation is stable inside, but the perimeter must be completely sealed. No one in or out." I walked past the empty cot, the linen thrown back haphazardly. It looked raw, exposed, a physical manifestation of the betrayal that had been nesting here for weeks. I glanced at the floor where I had searched for the syringe, where I had searched his box. The floorboard hiding my own small diary felt suddenly thin, dangerously exposed. I cleaned myself up quickly, pouring myself a small cup of cold coffee and sitting back at my desk. My hands were shaking, not from cold, but from the sudden, profound release of tension, coupled with the immediate realization of the danger I now faced. Davies knew. He knew I was the one who had seen him, cataloged his movements, and ultimately thwarted his mission. Thursday continuation. The remaining hours of the night were a blur of charting and waiting. I found myself unable to sit still, constantly moving through the ward, adjusting blankets, checking for drips that didn't exist, and staring at the communications wire. Around 0700, just as the sun was attempting to break through the persistent clouds, a new vehicle arrived. It wasn't a standard military jeep or an ambulance. It was a dark sedan, muddied, but clearly designed for quieter transport. A man stepped out. He wasn't dressed like a soldier or a surgeon. He wore a heavy, dark green coat and carried a worn leather briefcase. He had an air of quiet, relentless competence that felt heavier than any battlefield experience. He introduced himself to Dr. Thorne as Agent Clark, a special liaison officer from military intelligence. Thorne immediately directed him to me. Clark was lean, with dark, intense eyes. His manner was courteous, but his questions were precise and unforgiving. He didn't use military jargon. He used the language of observation and human behavior. "Nurse Miller," he began, sitting opposite me at the small desk, his presence somehow diminishing the entire workspace. "Dr. Thorne informed us of your initial suspicions and your swift action regarding the transport. We recovered the contents of the cot, the customized Bible, the radio pen, and the other artifacts confirm your assessment of Corporal Davies as a highly trained operative." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of vindication and exhaustion. I suspected him from the day he arrived, Agent Clark. His observation skills, his interest in logistics, the way he slept, and the methods of communication. Clark asked, leaning forward. "The ingestion of the button, the use of the fountain pen on the aerial wire, these are highly specialized techniques, rarely used in this theater. How did you deduce the transmission method?" I hesitated. I could not tell him I witnessed the swallowing of the button or the ritualistic use of the pen. That level of observation implied spying on my own patient, unauthorized searching, and a level of vigilance I couldn't easily justify outside of my own diary entries. "I only saw him holding the pen near the wire, Agent," I said, choosing my words carefully. I had already observed his strange interest in the communications line. When the lights went out, I saw him at the wire. Given his professional background in signals and the timing, I deduced he was attempting a quick burst communication. Clark looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He knew I was omitting details, but he accepted the answer. He needed results, not technical confessions. "Very astute, nurse. You managed to alter a strategic military operation based on a hunch and a remarkable degree of observation. The transport of the Major was successful, thanks to you. However, Davies is now loose. And he knows who you are." The words echoed my own fear. "He knows who you are." "He left this," I said, retrieving the small, wet paper from my pocket. It was barely legible now. "It's the note I saw him heating up." Clark took the paper with a gloved hand, examining the faded German script. "This confirms two things. One, that he got the message that his transport target was gone, and two, that he still managed to alert his contact that he was compromised. Funker radio operator, he is likely referring to himself. He knows he's burned, but his network does not yet know if he was captured or escaped." Clark paused, folding the residue carefully. "Davies is a ghost. We have reports that he was likely a double agent, placed in the British Signals Corps years ago. He is highly trained in deep cover and escape routes. He will not try to leave the area immediately. He needs to confirm what was taken from the ward and who identified him. He will be watching us." I felt a profound weariness settle over me. "So, we wait. We maintain routine, Nurse Miller. We make him believe we are simply patching up the generator and focusing on the pursuit in the woods. But inside," Clark tapped his briefcase, "we prepare for the counteraction." He spent the morning discreetly cataloging the site. He took the solitary muddy boot that Davies had left behind and placed it in a secure pouch. Before he left, he gave me one final instruction. "Continue your routine, nurse, but look beyond Davies now. He was here for 3 weeks. He was gathering information, yes, but he may also have been activating a sleeper or establishing a secondary contact within this immediate area. Do not trust anyone who asks too many questions about our security, or anyone who seems suddenly too eager to help the investigation." He looked toward Nurse Eliza, who was busy talking to Dr. Thorne. In this environment, betrayal often looks like excessive loyalty. Friday. The days immediately following the escape were characterized by a chilling normalcy. The security detail was pulled back slightly to avoid creating an atmosphere of panic, but I knew the area was riddled with discreet patrols. The physical exhaustion was profound. The sleepless nights of observation had finally caught up to me, but I couldn't allow myself to rest deeply. Every creak of the canvas, every sudden gust of wind, sounded like a footstep. I found myself meticulously cleaning Davies's former cot area. I wiped down the wooden table where the pen had rested, scrubbed the small stain near the wall, and replaced the damaged floorboard under my own cot, ensuring my diary was safe. It was a form of ritual purification, trying to erase the presence of deceit. I spent time talking with Nurse Eliza. She seemed genuinely shocked by the revelation that Davies was a spy. "I can't believe it, Flo," she said, her voice low as she folded surgical gauze. "He was so kind to Private Thompson, always giving him quiet reassurance. He looked so wounded. How can someone fake that level of pain?" "They are trained to, Eliza. To survive, they have to be convincing." I studied her face as she spoke. No hesitation, no defensive posture, just shock. Could she possibly be the secondary contact? She was cynical, but her devotion to patient care was absolute. The idea of Eliza being involved felt emotionally impossible, yet Clark's warning resonated. Do not trust anyone. I reflected on all the small favors Davies had exchanged. The biscuits shared with Private Harrison, the extended conversations with Sergeant O'Malley about the doctor's movements. Were these genuine attempts at camaraderie or small tests of loyalty and observation? I started charting the patient's conversations again, but this time I wasn't listening for Davies's input. I was listening for the echo of Davies, any patient or orderly who continued to subtly inquire about operational details. Even after the initial source of information had fled, nothing. Everyone was focused on their recovery, the arrival of mail, or the quality of the powdered eggs. The silence was deafening, suggesting either a complete withdrawal of the network or a contact point so deep in cover that they were now acting completely independently of the hospital's routine. I remembered Private Harrison as observation about the boots, the way Davies had carefully peeled back the leather lining to hide the note. The boot had been taken by Agent Clark, but I wondered about the surrounding area. Later that afternoon, I spent a long hour sweeping and mopping the floor around the location of the cot. I wasn't just cleaning, I was searching. I found it embedded deep in the grime under where the cot frame had been a tiny, metallic fiber, no bigger than an eyelash, glittering faintly in the dim light. It was dark silver and seemed manufactured, not natural. I carefully picked it up using tweezers and placed it on a white square of gauze. I realized it must be a remnant of the fountain pen. If the pen was a transmitter, it required internal mechanical components. The fiber could have been shed when Davies pressed the pen against his neck, or when he quickly handled it in the darkness of his escape attempt. It suggested the pen was not just a prop, but a highly complex, slightly fragile piece of equipment. I logged the discovery immediately in my diary, found metallic residue, possibly from the radio pen, near the former location of the cot. Evidence that the instrument was handled roughly during the escape. The realization was unnerving. Davies was so fastidious, so professional. For him to leave behind physical evidence, however minute, meant he was truly panicked during the power outage. His professionalism had failed him only because of the sudden, complete darkness and the speed of his flight. Saturday. The weekend brought a brief respite from new casualties, allowing me time to focus entirely on the silent investigation. Agent Clark had not returned, trusting me to maintain the vigilance on the ground. I walked the perimeter of the field hospital, an activity usually performed only by the orderlies or the doctor. I told Eliza I needed fresh air. The mud was still everywhere, heavy and slow. I mentally mapped Davies's escape path from the back flap, past the supply tent, and into the dense scrub leading to the main woods. Why that path? It was the muddiest route, the hardest to run across, yet it led most directly to the nearest thick cover. It also ran directly past the auxiliary supply tent, a smaller structure used for storing non-critical items like winter blankets, cleaning supplies, and replacement wood for the cook stove. I remember Davies's questions about the delivery routes and bottlenecks. He was interested in logistics and supply lines. I circled the supply tent slowly. It was secured with a standard latch and padlock. Nothing looked disturbed. That Davies was an agent of planning, not spontaneity. He spent 3 weeks in the ward. He would have used his time to prepare an extraction point or a temporary stash. I considered the nature of the message he sent, delayed. The radio operator is under observation. This message wasn't a plea for rescue. It was a professional status report. It meant his network knew he was in the vicinity and that he might need a retrieval or a new contact point established nearby. They wouldn't risk another direct contact unless they were certain the coast was clear, or unless they were retrieving an item of extreme value that Davies had planted. What if the escape was necessary not just to save himself, but to draw attention away from something he left behind? I walked the circumference of the supply tent again, moving slowly, inspecting the ground right at the base of the canvas wall. The earth was soft and dark. There was a small area right where the tent pole met the ground, where the mud looked slightly newer, slightly less compressed than the surrounding ground. It wasn't a footprint. It was a small circular depression about the size of a tea saucer. It had been covered with a thin layer of dead leaves and mud, deliberately disguised. I knelt down, pulling back the debris with my gloved fingers. Beneath the disturbed earth, I found a small, smooth river stone, perfectly round, about 4 inches in diameter. It looked like any other stone used to anchor the canvas, but its placement was too neat. I pulled it out gently. The stone felt unnaturally cold, and when I flipped it over, I saw that the underside was flat and slightly hollowed, covered with a thin layer of clear, hard wax, like the seal on a jar. This was not a natural occurrence. This was a hiding spot, a dry drop box concealed under the stone, right at the perimeter of the hospital, placed along his most likely escape route. I did not disturb the cavity. If it was empty, it meant the secondary contact had already retrieved the contents. If it was full, it meant the contents were still waiting for retrieval, and the contact was still in the area. I carefully replaced the stone, ensuring the small disturbance in the mud was recovered exactly as I had found it. I had to assume the spy's network was still observing this location. I returned to my desk, my heart heavy with discovery. Concealed drop box discovered near the supply tent perimeter. A flat, circular stone covering a small cavity in the mud. Contents unknown. Must observe the area. I decided I needed a permanent way to watch the drop box without being obvious. The main ward had a small window opening high up on the wall near the supply tent used primarily for ventilation. I knew if I moved my desk closer to that wall, claiming the kerosene fumes were bothering me, I could maintain a passive watch on that specific section of the perimeter. It took me an hour to slowly rearrange the desk, moving my charts and supplies. Eliza didn't question it. Dr. Thorne was too busy dealing with the shipment of outdated medication to notice my shifting furniture. My view was now perfect, a direct, if narrow, line of sight to the corner of the supply tent. Sunday. I thought about Corporal Davies' family, the photograph of his wife and son found inside the hollowed Bible. The sentimentality was likely manufactured, part of the cover. But sometimes, in this war, the line between performance and reality blurs. Did he feel anything when he tore up that personal letter and burned it? Or was he simply a machine dedicated solely to his mission? This is the hardest part of war nursing, maintaining compassion while recognizing the necessity of ruthlessness. My duty is to heal, but my immediate duty is to protect the men who rely on this facility. The constant tension of watching the drop box was worse than dealing with heavy casualties. Casualties are a physical problem, blood, bone, and infection that I can treat with tangible action. The drop box is a psychological problem, waiting for an action that may never come, or may happen while I am asleep or away. I wrote in my diary about the heavy feeling of distrust. I find myself watching everyone now. Every orderly, every walking wounded, even Eliza. I watch how they approach the supply tent. Do they linger? Do they look at the ground? Do they seem too casual? Orderly Private Harrison walked near the supply tent today. He was carrying a sack of refuse. He stopped for a moment, adjusted the load, and continued on to the incinerator barrel. His movement was perfectly natural, yet I cataloged the pause 3.5 seconds. He was the one who received the biscuit and who noticed the boots. Was he aware of the drop box, or was he simply tired? The air inside the hospital felt thick with unspoken possibilities. The other patients, recovering slowly, felt the tension too. They were quieter, less prone to joking, sensing the underlying security measures and the knowledge that a traitor had slept among them. The integrity of the Allied ward, I realized, was like the integrity of a well-set bone. You can't rush the healing. It requires patience, stillness, and a watchful eye for any sign of refracture. I had to remember Davies's timing. He waited for the midnight radio silence and the cover of darkness to transmit his message. His accomplice would likely wait for a similar moment of low security. Monday morning, Agent Clark had instructed me to look for the counteraction. It came, but not in the form of a direct retrieval. It was subtle, confusing, and designed to confirm Allied alertness. Around 0400, the deepest hour of the night, I was awake, watching the patch of ground near the supply tent. The moon was obscured, and the darkness was heavy. A sound broke the silence. It wasn't loud, just a single sharp tap. It came from the woods, perhaps 50 yards beyond the supply tent. It sounded like a small piece of metal striking stone. It was precise, singular, and then the silence returned. I waited, nothing else. No response from the security patrols I knew were hidden nearby. They must have dismissed it as an animal or a dropped piece of equipment. But I knew the sound signature. It reminded me of the small metallic noise I heard when Davies was working meticulously on his shirt button. It was intentional. I logged it immediately. Single metallic tap heard 0400 from the dense cover beyond the supply tent. Likely a testing signal to determine patrol readiness. Why tap only once? If he was trying to communicate information, it would be a series of taps. If he was signaling a location, it would be repeated. A single tap is a challenge. It's a question. Are you awake? Did you find the drop box? Are you prepared for my return? The single tap meant Davies knew we were watching. He wasn't afraid of the pursuit. He was testing the limits of our vigilance. He was likely using the metal fiber I had found, the delicate fragment from his pen, to make the noise, ensuring it was brief and difficult to trace. This signal, however, provided a crucial piece of insight into his operation. He was operating close enough to the hospital to conduct a sonic test, meaning he had secured a temporary hidden position within the immediate perimeter of the woods. He was waiting for his contact to move. I realized I couldn't wait any longer for the contact to move first. I had to confirm what was or wasn't in the drop box. Monday afternoon. I waited until the busiest time of the day when the delivery trucks arrived, causing chaos and noise near the main entrance. Everyone's attention, including the patrolling orderlies, was focused away from the supply tent. I walked casually toward the supply tent, carrying a coil of spare rope, pretending I needed to secure a loose section of the canvas against the wind. I knelt quickly by the base of the tent pole, fiddling with the rope. With one hand, I located the smooth, round stone. I used a small trowel I had hidden in my sleeve to carefully scrape away the dirt around it. I lifted the stone. The cavity underneath was small, maybe 5 inches deep and 4 inches across. It was lined with dry pine needles to protect the contents from moisture. The cavity was empty. My heart sank, then immediately raced with new urgency. The contents had been retrieved. The network had been operational, and the secondary contact had moved the information out of the perimeter. The retrieval had happened sometime between the time I discovered the stone, Saturday midday, and now, Monday afternoon. This meant the secondary contact was sophisticated. They hadn't acted during the obvious window of darkness on Wednesday night. They had waited for the investigation to settle down, demonstrating patience and a deep understanding of our routine. I replaced the stone, making sure the mud was compressed and the pine needles were undisturbed. I walked back toward the ward, the coil of rope heavy in my hand, thinking about the implications. If the contact had retrieved the information, they had done so without any dramatic shift in behavior, and without alarming me during my passive surveillance. They were someone whose presence near the supply tent would be considered entirely normal, someone who handled supplies, or someone who frequently walked the perimeter. This narrowed the field significantly. Dr. Thorne, unlikely too visible. Nurse Eliza, manages supplies. Private Harrison and the other orderlies handle refuse and logistics, or a long-term mobile patient who helps with chores. I focused my attention on Eliza. She frequently went to the supply tent to check inventory, often alone. Tuesday, I decided to create an operational diversion that would force the contact to reveal themselves, or at least confirm their knowledge of the supply tent routine. I knew Eliza was meticulous about the supply inventory. I walked into her office, a small partitioned area near the entrance, and placed a sheet of paper on her desk. Eliza, I know you're busy, but I need you to double-check the cold weather blankets in the auxiliary supply tent. I have a feeling the numbers on the manifest don't match what is actually stored there. Could you compare this inventory list with the physical stock, just to be sure? The inventory list I handed her was standard issue, but I had subtly altered the numbers for the final few items, specifically the wooden stakes used for tent repair. I reduced the number of stakes by 1, making the current manifest indicate a shortage. This was the trap. If the shortage was reported, it was normal procedure. But if the shortage was overlooked, or if the physical count was manipulated, it meant the counteragent had been in that tent recently and knew its contents were sensitive. Eliza took the list, sighing lightly. Of course, Flo, another bureaucratic headache. I'll get to it after I finish charting, Mr. Jenkins. I watched her through the day. She didn't rush. She maintained her calm, professional demeanor. She finished her charting, ate a small, efficient lunch, and then around 1500, grabbed a clipboard and walked toward the supply tent. This was the perfect time for a spy mid-afternoon, when energy is low and the light is high enough to work clearly, but the overall traffic is minimal. I watched through my narrow window. Eliza spent a good 15 minutes inside the supply tent. She emerged, clipboard in hand, and walked back to her office. I waited 5 minutes, then followed her. Everything match up, Eliza? She frowned slightly. Well, no, actually. The blankets were fine, but the manifest is wrong on the wooden stakes. It says we should have 38, but I only counted 37. One is missing. A genuine shortage, correctly identified. My trap had failed to flag Eliza as the contact. She was honest and meticulous, but as I looked at the sheet of paper, my attention snagged on a single detail. Next to the entry for the wooden stakes, Eliza had used her pen to add a small, handwritten correction, actual count 37. The way she had written the number 37 was peculiar. The number 3 was standard, but the number 7 had a long downward curve at the end, nearly touching the line below it. I asked casually, "You've got such neat handwriting, Eliza, always so precise." She smiled faintly. Years of charting flow, it teaches you. But I knew that curve on the 7 was not characteristic of her usual script. It looked forced, almost calligraphic. I went back to my desk and opened my diary. I reviewed the details of the coded dictionary Davies had left behind, the one with the circled German city names. I pulled out a piece of fresh paper and drew the curved 7 from Eliza as inventory. I began mentally rotating it, looking for symmetry. If the curve was not standard script, what was it? It was a small, almost microscopic hook. If the inventory list was viewed as a coordinate plane, the curved 7 acted like a directional arrow, pointing down and slightly right. I immediately remembered the railway spur Davies had inquired about, and the location of the drop box down and slightly right from the supply tent corner. I had been focusing on who retrieved the item, but perhaps Eliza, in her dutiful inventory check, was communicating the status of the supply tent location to the waiting operative. She wasn't the spy. She was the unwitting messenger, perhaps carrying an object or a scent, or simply confirming her movements were still predictable. But if she was simply the messenger, why the unusual 7? I suddenly realized the full horror of the sophistication. The missing wooden stake, the shortage I manufactured, was the actual trigger. Eliza reported a missing stake. The drop box was empty. Davies needed to know if the Allies were aware of the empty box, or if they just thought he had successfully escaped with his information. If Eliza reported 37, meaning one was missing, she was communicating that the drop point was compromised or cleared. If the inventory had shown 38, my initial false number, she would have confirmed the Allies were not tracking the internal supply. The curved 7, the direction, was superfluous unless it was a final confirmation. I felt a wave of dizziness. Eliza was unknowingly working for Davies, likely used as an innocent means of confirming logistical details. The level of operational control was staggering. They had weaponized bureaucracy. Wednesday, I called Agent Clark's office using the secure line Thorne had provided. I gave him the details, the single metallic tap, the empty drop box, and the anomalous 7 on the inventory chart. Clark listened patiently. Nurse, this confirms that the network is highly disciplined and is still in play. We suspected they would use routine logistics to verify status. The 7 is likely a confirmation mark, an assurance that the inventory check was clean and unobserved by Allied intelligence. But who retrieved the contents, Agent? If it wasn't Eliza, someone whose presence at the supply tent is routine. We are reviewing the movements of everyone associated with the field kitchen and quartermaster duties. But Davies may have already had the critical item on his person. If he used the biscuit tin as a temporary cache, the information might have been short-term. The empty drop box suggests it was merely a backup or a way to confirm that the location was still viable for future operations. Clark then gave me a chilling piece of instruction. Davies left one boot behind, the other one is with him. The boot is highly specific to his tradecraft. We believe the remaining boot may have a secondary counter-signal function. I remembered Harrison's. Observation, the highly polished sole, the careful preparation. Nurse, I want you to place the muddy boot he left behind back near the area of his cot. Make it look like it was simply overlooked during the initial cleanup. We need to see if the network reacts to the presence of the abandoned item. It was psychological warfare, using the spy's own operational tools against him. I retrieved the boot from the small storage locker where Clark had placed it. It was heavy with caked mud, the leather scuffed from his desperate flight. I carefully placed it under the adjacent cot, half hidden by a stack of clean blankets, exactly where an orderly might have missed it during a hurried cleanup. Thursday, the boot was in place. The entire ward felt like a stage set for an audience that might or might not be watching. The heavy canvas and the constant drumming of the rain only amplified the sense of isolation and tension. I kept my eyes on the boot. Who would move it? who would show undue interest. Sergeant O'Malley, now recovering well, grumbled about the mess. Nasty boot nurse, can we get that monstrosity out of here? Smells like a swamp. Private Thompson, still dealing with shell shock, merely stared at it blankly. The orderlies cleaned around it, careful not to touch it, assuming it was a quarantined item or a piece of evidence reserved for the intelligence officers. The boot sat there, a muddy, inert challenge. The afternoon was slow. I was charting, but my focus remained fixed on the small, muddy obstruction. Around 1700, Nurse Eliza walked past the cot, carrying a basin of warm water. She stopped, staring at the boot. Her expression was purely one of distaste. Honestly, Flo, that thing needs to go. It's disrupting the hygiene of the ward. I know, Eliza, I replied calmly. It's part of the evidence. Agent Clark wants it left there for now. Eliza frowned, but didn't argue. She simply adjusted the basin in her hands and moved on. Her reaction was purely annoyance at the breach of cleanliness, a core part of her professional identity. Another test passed. I started thinking about the metallic fiber again. Davies had to have a way to communicate the success or failure of his escape. The single tap was confirmation of his position. The missing Dropbox contents confirmed the network was active. But what if the secondary item wasn't the contents of the Dropbox, but the Dropbox itself? The round stone with the wax seal. I walked the perimeter of the supply tent again, ensuring the stone was still buried. It was. Davies had placed it there. It was a secure, highly personal concealment method. If he was running, he wouldn't rely on his network to retrieve the contents entirely. He might want them to retrieve the container if the contents were exceptionally sensitive and required professional analysis, perhaps microdots or a piece of complex mechanism. If the stone was the target, why hadn't anyone retrieved it? Because the network was waiting for a signal that the coast was clear, a signal that only Davies could provide. And then I looked at the muddy boot sitting inertly under the cot. Davies had polished the solace. Harrison confirmed it. He treated the boots as if they were operational instruments. I walked up to the boot, knelt down, and reached out with a clean piece of gauze. I didn't touch the laces or the leather. I touched the sole. The mud was dry now, hard-caked. I scraped a small piece of the hardened mud off the sole. It crumbled easily. I examined the sole under the lamplight. The grooves of the tread were deep and complex. But right in the center of the heel, there was a small, almost invisible imperfection, a slight discoloration. I picked at it gently with a sterile pen. The discolored area came away cleanly. It wasn't mud. It was a thin layer of highly specialized, heavy rubber cement or sealant, meticulously applied to conceal something inside the sole. The boot wasn't a decoy. It was a second drop box. I hurried to Dr. Thorne's office, securing the boot carefully in a blanket. Doctor, I need to use your tools. I need to open the sole of this boot, now. Thorne, tired but sensing the urgency, didn't question me. He laid out a thin scalpel, tweezers, and a small magnifying glass on his clean desk. I worked slowly, using the scalpel to peel back the layer of concealed sealant. It took nearly 10 minutes of agonizing, careful work. When the sealant was fully removed, a small circular cavity was revealed in the rubber heel. And inside, perfectly dry and pristine, was a tightly rolled scroll of paper, secured with a small piece of dark silk thread. I removed the scroll with the tweezers. It was not the yellowish cigarette paper. This was white, high-quality, thin paper. I unrolled it carefully. It was covered in a dense pattern of microdots, tiny, almost invisible dots of ink applied in a grid. This was the intelligence he had gathered over 3 weeks. The key to Allied logistics, troop movements, and the specific vulnerabilities of our supply chain. And it had been sitting there, waiting for a retrieval, disguised as a muddy piece of refuse. Friday. I immediately secured the microdots and reported the discovery to Agent Clark. His response was immediate and filled with professional satisfaction. Excellent work, Nurse Miller. This is what we needed. Davies knew the hospital would be under surveillance. He engineered his escape to leave behind the most valuable asset, knowing it would be mistaken for junk. He knew we would focus on the drop box and the perimeter, not the internal deception. What about the coded dictionary and the pen? Were those just distractions? I asked, partially. They are necessary parts of his kit that he couldn't risk carrying in his flight, but the microdots are the prize. They are being analyzed now. We have what we need. I felt a profound sense of accomplishment, but the tension was still high. But Agent, the contact doesn't know we have this. They will come for the boot? Precisely, Nurse. We will return the boot to its original location, empty now, of course, but resealed to look intact. We will let the contact make their move. This was the final stage, the most dangerous. The spy was gone, but his extension was still here, inside the walls of the Allied ward. We resealed the boot, painstakingly recreating the layer of sealant over the now empty cavity. It was placed back under the cot. I returned to my desk, sitting in the silence. The boot was a magnet now, drawing out the hidden threat. I had to assume the contact knew the exact method of extraction, that they would approach the boot, check the sole, and find the sealant. Who would be able to spend the necessary time alone with the boot, under the cover of routine? It had to be someone with a legitimate reason to handle the cot or the refuse, an orderly or a Nurse Eliza during cleaning hours. I was exhausted, but I forced myself to focus. I prepared a pot of strong, bitter coffee. I had to remain vigilant through the night, Saturday morning. The night was long and cold. I spent the time reading medical texts, occasionally checking the patients, and always watching the inert boot under the cot. At 0345, the moon finally broke through the clouds, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor. I heard a distinct, soft shuffling near the cot. It wasn't the groan of a sleeping soldier. It was deliberate movement. I looked up slowly. It was Private Harrison, the orderly. He was ostensibly collecting dirty blankets from the cots. He moved silently, his movements practiced and efficient. He reached Davies's former cot, pulling the adjacent cot blankets toward him. Then he paused. He didn't look at the boot immediately. He looked at my desk. I kept my head down, pretending to be deeply engrossed in my medical ledger. I counted his breaths. Harrison knelt down, reaching for the blanket under which the boot was semi-concealed. He pulled the blanket away, exposing the muddy leather. He didn't grab the boot to throw it away. Instead, he reached into the breast pocket of his orderly's smock and pulled out a small, folded piece of cloth. He used the cloth to handle the boot, ensuring no direct contact. He gently turned the boot over, examining the sole. He pressed the area where the sealant was located. He was looking for the edge of the opening. His fingers worked quickly, efficiently, testing the integrity of the patch. I realized then Harrison wasn't just an unwitting orderly. He was the secondary contact, positioned within the logistics of the hospital, the person with the most legitimate reason to handle refuse and shift supplies. His interest in the biscuits was likely Davies testing his loyalty or ensuring he was a reliable asset. Harrison found the edge of the sealant and began to peel it away using a small, polished steel implement that looked like a dental tool, a piece of surgical equipment easily stolen from the supply tent. He paused for a long second, holding the tool steady. He was working in the dim light, relying entirely on touch. He peeled back the resealed patch. He then carefully reached inside the cavity with his tweezers. The moment he realized the cavity was empty, his hands froze. The silence of the ward was absolute. Harrison didn't make a sound of shock or panic. His body simply went rigid, realizing the failure of the mission. He had been sent to retrieve the critical intelligence, and it was gone. He slowly replaced the boot, secured the tweezers and the dental tool, and finished collecting the remaining blankets. He walked past my desk, his face a mask of exhaustion and resignation. As he passed, I looked up, meeting his eyes briefly. They were dark, shadowed, and completely empty of the cheerful politeness he usually displayed. I didn't say anything. I simply made a small mark on the ledger, confirming the completion of the night's activity. Within 5 minutes, Agent Clark and two military police officers who had been waiting in the adjacent doctor's office moved swiftly and silently. They intercepted Harrison as he entered the utility tent, ostensibly to sort the dirty laundry. There was no violence, no sound of struggle, only the soft click of the utility room door closing firmly. The secondary threat was neutralized. The intelligence was secure. Saturday morning, the sun rose on a quiet ward. The only sign of the night's events was the lingering smell of damp wool and the fact that Private Harrison's cot in the orderly quarters was empty. Agent Clark returned around 1000, looking less tense than he had the previous days. He confessed immediately, Nurse Miller, not out of fear, but out of professional realization that the mission was compromised. He was coerced, not ideologically driven, a common tactic. Davies had identified him as vulnerable, a young man with a debt he couldn't pay. Harrison provided the logistical details that Davies needed for his operational cover, confirming when supplies moved and when the guards changed. And the microdots? The intelligence is priceless. Nurse, it allowed us to confirm the movement of several enemy assets who were planning an infiltration along the very railway spur Davies was interested in. You saved far more than just the Major's transport. I felt relief, but also a deep sorrow for Harrison. He was a victim of Davies's ruthless selection process, used and discarded. I looked at the empty space under the cot where the boot had been. Clark had taken the boot as evidence. What about Davies' agent? He is still out there, highly dangerous and now highly motivated to remain silent. But his network is broken in this sector. He has lost his logistical support, his intelligence source, and his escape route. He is just a man hiding in the woods now, waiting for rescue that won't come. Clark packed his briefcase, ready to return to HQ. Before leaving, he looked at me, a genuine flicker of respect in his eyes. You're an exceptional observer, Nurse Miller. You understood the nature of the threat. It's hard to see the battle when it is being fought over a biscuit tin and a ledger entry. It's my job to see the small things, Agent. That's how we keep them alive. The war continued outside the field hospital, a relentless presence marked by the distant thud of artillery and the constant churn of the supply lines. But inside, the ward returned to its necessary rhythm of healing. The empty spaces left by Davies and Harrison healed quickly, covered over by the arrival of new patients, the constant movement of the orderlies, and the dedication of the nurses. I find myself still watchful, but the annoying paranoia has subsided. I know the true nature of vigilance now. It is not about looking for the dramatic act of violence. It is about recognizing the pattern of deception, the small deviation from routine. I still sit at my desk late into the night, knitting, charting, and listening. The communications wire still hums faintly overhead, but now it feels like a simple piece of infrastructure, not a conduit for betrayal. The round stone near the supply tent is still buried, undisturbed, a mute memorial to a battle fought and won in silence. I sometimes wonder about Davies out there in the cold, wet woods, cut off from his support. He was a ruthless enemy, but a man of immense discipline. I hope in the quiet solitude of his flight, he realized the skill of the woman who defeated him, a nurse who simply chose to look closer at the wound, the boot, and the lie. The greatest lessons of this war are often found not in the bold moves of armies, but in the quiet endurance of individuals. We keep the lights on, we sterilize the instruments, and we watch the small things, ensuring that the integrity of the life we are trying to save remains unbroken. My diary, secured beneath the floorboard, is now complete. It is the record of the quiet war fought in the shadow of the loud one, a war against betrayal, won through patience and the simple, professional dedication to observation. I will keep writing, of course, but the urgent, heavy pressure of suspicion is finally gone. The ward is safe. And for tonight, that is enough. The wind rustles the canvas, carrying the scent of pine and rain. I sip my lukewarm coffee and pick up my chart, ready for the next patient. The long watch continues, but now it is a watch rooted in peace.